everybody. My name is Brian Perry, and I'm very proud to be a part of Ridgefield Allies. What can I do? What can we do? Welcome to our second live stream event, and this one is called and surrounds the ideas that relate to strategies for engaging across disagreement. So, first, I just want to say a big welcome to everybody in Ridgefield and anyone beyond Ridgefield who is listening or will listen in the future. And also a happy Father's Day to those who are fortunate enough to be able to celebrate with their fathers today. Just a quick word about Ridgefield Allies. We're a grassroots community organization, and we're taking steps in the struggle for racial justice locally. Our goal is to highlight what we can do as individuals and as a community, and to bring together bright minds to educate, inspire, and motivate our community to take action against racism. We support and seek to be active allies to organizations taking the lead in the fight for racial justice in America, including Color of Change, Black Lives Matter, and the NAACP. We support them in their mission, and you can too. So the idea for today's live stream came from a lot of us at Ridgefield Allies observing social media and the way people are arguing with each other, and frankly, from my own personal failings in engaging other white people surrounding all these ideas. The thing that I have really learned is that it's simply not enough to be right. So if you're introducing the idea of systemic racism to someone who's never heard of this before, how do you even begin to unpack that? You can't just rely on the fact that you are right. We need strategies. We need thoughtful, mindful strategies to make us better debaters, better arguers, and at the bottom line, we must change minds and hearts. I think a lot has been revealed since the death of George Floyd, one of many deaths at the hands of police brutality over the course of the last many years. And I think it's been quite revealing to learn how our friends and neighbors might think. As we at Ridgefield Allies really believe that it's time to engage. We've already waited too long, and we've been too complacent while our friends of color suffer. I'd like to also offer a little challenge to everybody. If at the end of this you come away with more strategies and more knowledge, I challenge you not to unfriend people who disagree with you. It's the unfriending makes us more comfortable, and I think we as allies, as white people, need to be okay with being uncomfortable. We also need to be okay with the idea that we may have been wrong in the past and may continue to be wrong and may continue to make mistakes. That's why we're here today. We cannot get tired, we cannot get comfortable again. As the media stops sort of covering the protests that are going on, we can't let this leave the front of our minds. Our friends of color's lives literally depend on it. We're realizing as a whole, as a collective, it's not enough to occasionally comment on social media or post infrequently. There's this idea of optical allyship that has gone around, so we don't want to be performative. We want to actually make change. We at Ridgefield Allies believe that we must all combine this drive for change with strategy and knowledge. We must use our emotions as fuel, but not let them overwhelm us to the point where we are ineffective communicators who are ultimately incapable of changing hearts and minds. Simply put, it's just time to do better. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Jenna Lauder, incredibly qualified, wonderful human being. Please feel free to ask questions in the Facebook comment section. Once Jenna's done with her presentation, I will take these questions and ask her for you. So just a little bit about Jenna. I'm going to read her bio here because it's quite impressive. Jenna Lauder came to Columbia Law School after several years in government and politics. She began her career in the New York governor's office, first serving as Governor Cuomo's briefer and later working on policy development. After nearly 3 years with the administration, Jenna left state service for a local political consulting firm where she worked on progressive issue advocacy campaigns. In summer 2016, Jenna joined the Hillary for America campaign as New York's deputy organizing director. After the election, she volunteered as a national organizer of the Women's March. Yes, and stayed active within the organization as a member of the Political Engagement Committee. Along with several of her Women's March colleagues, Jenna co-founded the Resistance Revival Chorus in 2017, an all-women's choir that has performed at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, and the Grammy Awards. Love that. Most recently, Jenna worked as an advocate for nonprofit organizations with Cassirer, a New York City lobbying firm. At Columbia, Jenna serves as campus outreach coordinator for the Rikers Island Book Group and is submissions editor for the Journal of Gender and Law, in addition to her work with CLWA. She previously competed on the LA Moot Court team and served as a 1L representative for the Columbia Law Democrats. Jenna looks forward to spending her 1L summer as an intern with the Mecklenburg County Defenders and Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. Jenna graduated with a degree in political science and human rights from Barnard College in 2013. Thrilled to welcome Jenna Lauder.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for that very flattering and slightly mortifying introduction. I appreciate it. Before I get started, I just want to put out one disclaimer that I am not an expert on what I'm about to discuss or on anti-racism. And I think that that is just really important to state from the outset. I think I can be a relatable source of information because I, like you, only started coming to this work a few years ago. As Brian mentioned, I worked in government and politics before the 2016 campaign, but I think like so many people, the outcome of that 2016 election was really, an awakening for me and was very disillusioning. So I've had the opportunity to come into contact with many incredible Black women organizers who have taught me so much and who I continue to learn from and to seek out resources for my own education. So today I'm going to share some things that I've learned so far along the way that have been helpful to me, and hopefully they will be helpful to you as well. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, we're in. So let's see, can I skip to the next slide? There we go. So Brian did an excellent job, I think, of previewing a lot of the themes that I'm going to touch on today. So as he mentioned, it's so important that we approach all of this work with a growth mindset. We're not experts, we don't know everything, and we will inevitably make mistakes. So as we engage with others, I think it's important to make sure that we take criticisms and feedback as valuable opportunities to learn ourselves and to grow and become better allies. Another theme that I think is helpful to keep in mind is our privilege can be used in a productive way. I sometimes think of it like a Trojan horse. A lot of us feel a lot of guilt around our privilege, and that's certainly understandable. But it allows us to occupy spaces where, decisions are being made and where we have some capacity to change the way our society is structured. So using that access, for instance, what I'm doing right here today, is a way of using our privilege to undo the structurally racist systems that kind of got us here in the first place. And then lastly, just a reminder that I'm sure none of you all need, is that if we're not being actively anti-racist, we are being complicit. I saw what I thought was a really helpful YouTube video the other day of someone who analogized structural racism to basically pushing a boulder up a big cliff. If we're not constantly pushing upwards, the boulder is just going to roll right back down backwards. So it's important that we never rest, that we keep working, and the more people who are doing this work, the lighter the boulder will feel. So it's important that we're all here doing our best all the time. So I'm going to share a few do's and don'ts, some high-level ways of looking at engaging with people who view things differently from you. And then I'll get into some more specific techniques and strategies that I sometimes find to be helpful. So some of the do's. Call people in rather than calling them out. So Brian indicated this, if you immediately set an adversarial tone or try to, poke out how wrong somebody is, especially on a public platform like social media, their guard is going to go up. They're going to become defensive. The goal is really to invite people to become part of a conversation with you so that you can help change their thinking. Second, converse, don't confront. This is something that I actually learned in law school when I was on the moot court team. I think I, like possibly some of you, had this view of oral arguments in a courtroom as, this really adversarial, high, tense environment with people pounding their fists on a table. And the first thing that they taught us in moot court was that is absolutely the wrong approach to take. You want to be having a calm, reasonable conversation with the judge and opposing counsel. That's what allows people to sort of soften their guard and listen, be open, receptive to what you have to say. Be a partner to others. in learning, sort of like what I'm trying to do here. You can offer yourself as a buddy, make it an experience of shared camaraderie as you educate yourself and others together. Provide reputable resources. Cannot stress this enough. There's so much misinformation and wild conspiracies floating around there these days. If you are going to share facts, resources, opinion pieces, and you absolutely should, just make sure that they're coming from reliable sources. It's really helpful to set sort of a baseline agreement of facts so that you can engage with other people from, sort of a shared understanding. It's also helpful when you're sharing articles from experts that you can say, don't take it from me, but read this article that explains and breaks it down really clearly and thoroughly. Identify and explain structural and systemic racism. This is also something that we're seeing people talk about a lot more these days, and I think is really important. So much of the time, and especially in the conversation around policing, we can get caught up in arguments about bad apples, specific instances of one individual who did something bad. And while that's certainly, unacceptable and can illustrate the problems, it can also be a distraction from the underlying systems and structures that generate these types of attitudes to begin with. Know that changing minds is slow and steady work. This is also difficult, and I know it requires a lot of patience. But it's highly unlikely that you're going to come into a conversation and completely change the way someone sees the world in one sitting. You need to be prepared to have multiple conversations, to see slow change, and to allow the person time and space to do the internal work. So that's why, Brian mentioned at the beginning, it's important to keep showing up and to be consistent. Lastly, know when to leave a conversation. If a conversation is becoming openly hostile and the person that you're speaking with is clearly not receptive to what you have to say, it's probably best just to back away and not expend more of your time and energy on them. Your efforts can probably be put towards a more productive use. A few don'ts. As I mentioned before, it's best not to take a combative, confrontational approach. You'll put people on their guard, and what you really want them to do is to listen to you. The second one is something that I know I have absolutely struggled with, which is coming across as a bit self-righteous or preachy. My family specifically, I used to get into debates with them about racial justice issues. And, I care a lot about this. I would get really impassioned. And apparently my voice would take on a really high pitch. And what they told me over and over again was that as soon as my voice got into that pitch, they just completely stopped listening to me. It was unbearable. So try to keep your emotions in check as much as you can. Another important point, I think, is that we don't want to make this about good people versus bad people, about being informed versus ignorant or compassionate versus selfish. We all have a tendency to think that we are good people, and we might be good people. And so what we want to do is to separate out particular acts, behaviors, or views that you disagree with and try to work through those as opposed to attacking somebody overall as being, a bad person, quote unquote. Third, don't get too in the weeds of rebuttal. So it can be tempting sometimes if someone is posting something that's completely absurd and off base and to be false, to go in there and break down their arguments point by point. And while it's absolutely important to combat misinformation, and if something is blatantly, objectively false, say so and provide a resource to back you up. But you don't necessarily want to spend lots of time arguing on their own terms. This keeps us in the framework of right and wrong, and that's less helpful. What's more helpful is to try to get into the person's frame of mind and overall worldview and try to engage with them about shifting their perspective. Along those lines, don't attempt to discredit someone's entire worldview in a single conversation. people have held their views their entire lifetimes, and we all can be very attached to our own sense of righteousness, of individual personal superiority, and also our notions of security. Trying to basically take a crowbar to somebody's whole, value system in one conversation is just not going to end well. We're basically asking people to voluntarily give up a security blanket, an existential security blanket that they've been carrying for their entire lives. And that's going to take time, and it's going to take some trust. All of that being said, there is no reason to ever lend legitimacy to racist views. While I encourage you to validate people's feelings and personal experiences, you absolutely do not need to, tell them that they're right when they're not, or create space for behavior that is harmful and generally unacceptable. It is really important that you draw a line, and you can tell them, I don't think that type of language is helpful, or I think that statement might be hurtful to XYZ based on, ABC. So absolutely know where the line is and stand your ground. A quick note on shame, and I thought this was a really insightful quote from a Vox article from a couple of years ago. Our revolutionary ancestors used shaming and shunning to encourage change, to help tribal members reform their transgressive behavior and then reintegrate. Helpful shame always leaves room for improvement, rather than making someone feel fundamentally worthless with no hope for growth. So basically, shame can be really useful on a societal level. It helps us to draw boundaries around what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable behavior. A recent example of this is the Me Too movement, where a critical mass of society basically came out and said that we will no longer tolerate sexual harassment and abuse, even from society's most powerful. And so we ostracized a bunch of men, abusers, in a pretty public way to send a signal that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. On a personal level, though, you have to be really careful with shame. If you're shaming someone one-on-one, and especially in a public forum like Facebook, they can just immediately put their walls up and withdraw and seek validation elsewhere. The way that shame can be useful is by, you have to separate people's views and ideas and actions from who they are as an entire human being. Allow them space to say, I know you're a good person, but this particular behavior is not acceptable in society. Let's teach you how to become, more attuned to our values and to come back into the fold. All right, so those are some overarching do's and don'ts. And now I will talk about a few more concrete strategies. So pursuant to what I've said before about, opening up a dialogue, one really good way to do this is to come into the conversation low and humble. Know that winning is not the point. If you approach the conversation from more of a supplicant posture, you're more likely to get the other person to engage because they will feel less attacked. And I wanted to include this quote from a poet who I absolutely love that I think is really a helpful way of looking at this. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So just remember that this isn't about you necessarily proving how righteous you are, how informed you are. It's about inviting someone who thinks very differently to start to interrogate their own views and beliefs. Another really good way of doing this is to focus on shared values. Common ground can be really useful sort of magic words that invite people to engage with you. It helps to bridge the divide, so it's less like you're shouting across an ideological chasm and more like you're standing together, learning how to approach society together. Take the conversation offline. People, I know I can be much more self-conscious and probably defensive when I am having a conversation about an issue that's very, new to some of us and very charged, like anti-racism. So if you can, have the conversation in private messenger, or text your friend, or invite them to have coffee with you, or a phone call. I guess coffee is in a pre-corona world. But going, having a long multi-message Facebook debate out in the open might be a scarier place for people to admit that they're wrong. Think about facts versus feelings and come prepared. I think that feelings, emotions, stories are really important for encouraging someone to care about an issue. And in particular, I think documentaries and videos can be really useful for that. But when you're having more of a debate or an online exchange with someone, those feelings or personal anecdotes can be less compelling. Facts can help you, ground your argument in something objective that's harder to dispute. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really important the types of sources you use. I suggest that you stick to sort of generally agreed upon reputable sources like the New York Times or PBS or, academic experts. And certainly whenever possible, you should be quoting and citing back to Black people who have been doing this work for a long time. It's also helpful to come prepared, not only with links to resources, but even to memorize certain facts or statistics that you find to be particularly poignant. So I've included a few here that I find to be, just really striking. And so if you can commit those to memory, that way you can pull them out of your pocket when you're having a conversation with somebody. Tailor your information to the other person's interests, experience, or industry. Unfortunately, structural racism is absolutely everywhere in society. It's completely pervasive. And so it shouldn't be too hard to find, examples or hidden histories of how racism has manifested in various industries and fields. So if somebody works in the film industry, they might be particularly interested or receptive to information about how structural racism operates in the film industry. If someone is a teacher or involved in education in some capacity, you can share information about racism in schools. Not only might they be more interested in that type of information, but they also might feel more empowered to actually make change in an area where they have some influence. Ask questions. This can be super helpful in encouraging the other person to engage with you. Certain questions that you can ask are, why do you believe that? Where did you receive this information or idea? Or, what inspired you to develop this view or belief? These questions sound benign, but they can encourage people to really interrogate how they formed their beliefs. I think a lot of times we sort of have this idea that we develop our own perspective somehow through our own, intelligence and personal experiences. But a lot of what we assume about the world was actually taught to us from external sources. So asking these types of questions that get at, the basic modus operandi that people are working with can help them to distance themselves from the idea, which allows space for them to unlearn some of the harmful histories, thoughts, behaviors that they might have. Along similar lines, encourage introspection, and that goes both for yourself and for the person that you're engaging with. Invite people to interrogate their whiteness. I know that is maybe uncomfortable for a lot of us. It's not something that we're often confronted with or asked to do because whiteness is the dominant culture in society. It sort of goes unacknowledged. But encourage people to think about what it is that they particularly enjoy or appreciate about being white. That can be an interesting exercise to sort of shake up your own views and sense of identity and make some space for you to learn and grow. You can also do an associational exercise. So for example, right now with the conversation happening over defunding the police and abolition, invite your friends, your family, whoever it is you're engaging with, to write down the first 5 words that you associate with police in your community. Then see what they are, see what surprises you, reflect on it, and discuss. And you might actually be surprised by what comes to the surface. Lastly, talk about your own personal experiences of learning and awakening. I think this can be incredibly useful. It's what I try to do with my own family and friends, and what I'm doing with you all here. So, for example, if someone posts something that you find harmful or ignorant or is perpetuating a perspective that's not helpful, you can respond by saying something like, "I was recently surprised to learn that blank, and it really made me think about X, and I realized that Y. So now I'm going to do more of Z, and I would love for you to join me." It sounds formulaic, but I think it's a really non-intimidating and encouraging way to invite people to be part of the learning experience. So before I wrap up, just a couple of points to remember. Having conversations is not a substitute for doing the internal work. In fact, you're going to have the most productive conversations when you yourself are grappling with your own internalized, ideas of white supremacy and learned racism. So make sure that, you're starting with yourself first, and it will help you figure out what's going to be useful when you're working with others. Also remember to walk the walk. Engaging the white community is really important, but it needs to lead to action. Ask yourself, will members of the Black community actually feel the impact of what I'm doing? And to help them feel that impact, get involved. Get involved in your local government and politics. Figure out who your local representatives are, not just at the federal or state level, but know who your local judges or DAs are, know who's on your local school board, go to town council meetings if that's the type of government that you have, and find out what small policies and decisions are being made at the local level that will have racial implications. Most of them will, and use your privilege to be able to speak up. The same goes for the work environment, especially if you have any sort of sway over hiring and promotion decisions. Use your access, use your privilege to advocate for diversity and inclusion and real meaningful changes at your organization. Get involved in your children's schools and community organizations, and in protests and direct actions, which I'm sure many of you have already been doing. Support Black candidates for office. This is also super important, and some studies have shown that Black candidates and also women candidates face challenges, especially with fundraising. So if you can, donate to them, donate to, follow, support Black-led organizations and Black-owned businesses. I'm sure you've all seen the hashtag recently, Amplify Melanated Voices. Continue to give people of color, specifically Black people who have been doing this work for a long time, a platform. And absolutely put your money where your mouth is. And lastly, follow Black leaders, experts, and organizations, and pay them for their time and work. Cannot stress that enough. So I will just leave you with a few resources that I have found helpful. It's certainly a non-exhaustive list. There's so much incredible work and scholarship and advocacy out there, but these are just a few places that you could start. I especially recommend the anti-racism resources list that I've listed first here. That includes, probably 100 different resources, from books to movies to podcasts to articles and organizations, that you will find something that speaks to you there, and is a great place to start your learning. So with that, I think I will pass it back to Brian for a Q&A.
Jenna, thank you. That was so enlightening and thoughtful, and Ridgefield, I know, I'm just from reading the comments, is so grateful. I think you opened up a lot of minds to a lot of sort of unexpected ideas. One that keeps coming up is this idea of helpful shame.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if one of the specific questions is, can you share tactics for helpful shame? I love the concept, but would like to better understand, so I guess more of a practical application, if there is one on the micro level.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that what's happening on Facebook certainly is one, example of that. I think it's just really that there's a fine line between commenting on someone's caption or photo and saying, I find this to be unhelpful, or, a lot of people would disagree with that. Let me know if you want to talk. That can be sort of gentle shaming where you are publicly calling out that the person, isn't necessarily conforming with accepted views, but you're not overall saying, wow, you're a terrible racist. I'm going to unfriend you and block you from my feed, I also think that shame can be useful on a personal level. We sort of shame ourselves to some extent. And that is, it encourages us to live up to our own ideals and expectations. So it's sort of like that little conscience in the back of your head.
Yeah, what a brilliant way to reframe shame. I think that's really, really helpful. Thank you for that.
I'll say one more thing because I think this conversation definitely focused on interpersonal conversations, but I think shame also has a really useful role when it comes to elected officials and leaders. It is their job to be responsive to the people. And so sending a really strong and, maybe even aggressive signal that you are not okay with what they're doing can actually cause them to change their policies. I mean, we've seen that in New York and New York City for sure. I don't know if many of you saw a bunch of Mayor de Blasio's current staff members signed onto a public letter saying that they disagreed with how he was handling all of the protests and were ashamed of the job he was doing. And so I think that was a really good example of how public shame can be used to get a public official to change their stance.
Absolutely. It's a strong tool that's been so sort of, I wouldn't say demonized in a way, but it's definitely been like in the Brene Brown world. It's been very sort of like, we deal with our personal shame and it's wrong, but to be able to use it productively is just so smart. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Another question for you. I'm just reading these. When using these tactics on social media, if the administrator of the group is allowing space for harmful, unacceptable behavior, is it appropriate to stay and, in quotes, fight the good fight? I have felt that staying legitimizes the group through the volume of group members. So this is actually a situation we've had in town, and it's a lot of us feel very conflicted about it, and we've engaged and in every way we can. But I'm curious what your take on something like that is.
That's a difficult situation. I think the obvious place to start is to speak to whoever the administrator of the group is. I think that's the type of one-on-one conversation that really needs to be had to help them understand why creating space for hateful speech is not productive, and it's not necessarily fair and balanced isn't always the right approach when there are certain moral truths. That being said, if the administrator isn't willing to change their approach, I think part of our privilege as white people is that we can be exposed to some of this more hateful rhetoric, and it's less traumatizing for us. And, we haven't had to carry this burden for so long. So I think sort of gathering your white people is something that we can call upon ourselves to do. If you are going to stay in the group, I would make sure that your presence is consistently used to push back on those types of, on things that are problematic. So I wouldn't stay in the group and just be a silent observer. I would stay in the group only if you are going to use that space to, try to educate. It's difficult. I don't know that there's a right answer, but I think, you can continually keep posting things that you think might be educational, that even if the people in the group aren't going to outwardly express that it's changing their minds, maybe they'll take a little piece of what you're sharing with them and they'll on it,
I mean, do you have a feeling about is there a line where a person has sort of given too much, they should stop? Do people need to protect themselves when they start to feel unsafe in all these things? Like it's hard. I know for me to find that line, and this is not about me, but I know from my own personal experience, I start to go nuts, and it affects my life, and I don't have the luxury. I mean, that's a privilege that I can even say that, but I'm just curious what your thoughts on the emotional line and taking care of yourself so that you can fight the marathon or run the marathon and not the sprint.
That is a great question, and that's a conversation I've been having with my own friends in the past few days. I think that you hit the nail on the head that we are privileged in that we can turn off and stop paying attention to the conversation if we choose to do so. So many people of color don't have the luxury of doing that. They're confronted by racism every day. So being aware of that is important. That being said, my little sister always says, is my favorite expression, you can't pour from an empty cup. So you need to make sure that you are taking care of yourself and approaching all of this work from a place of love. I think, I maybe indicated that, but didn't say it explicitly. We can't organize from a place of anger or hate or frustration. It really has to be out of, an affirmative vision of a more loving, bountiful, gentle world that we're trying to build together. And so if you find yourself just sort of at your wit's end, maybe take a minute and try to center and come back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to sort of pause a debate and come back.
Absolutely. As long as you come back. I think that's really the key.
Mm-hmm.
Take a breath, replenish, and do it in an intentional way. So that might be, we've all heard a lot about self-care lately, but, it's not necessarily about doing a face mask and painting your nails, sit with yourself, think about things, read some poetry that resonates with you, do it in a meaningful way, and then come back to the work, because consistency is just so important.
Yeah, you're talking about active rest in a way, which is great. One other, and we're just about out of time, so just a couple more little questions. I like this question a lot. How can minors assert themselves confidently without worrying about a child's place? Or how can adults be better about actively listening to the newer generation?
That's such a good question. So I am not a parent myself, so this is not something that I have personally encountered, but I think something I've been learning as I've gotten more involved in the activist community is the unique space and role that youth has always played in activist movements. They are the future. They often have more progressive ideas, and it's their world that they're going to inherit. So giving them credibility and really validating their perspectives and their voices is so important for building their own self-esteem, encouraging them to stay engaged, and modeling that type of affirmation and validation that they can use when engaging with others. So I think it's scary probably in the age of social media where, something your kid posts when they're 14 can be out there forever. But I think trusting your kids is really important. Have conversations with them so that, they're informed, let them have access to all of the information so that they can be informed, empowered advocates, and be proud of them for engaging.
Yeah, so it's kind of about not sheltering them from the reality of the world.
Absolutely. I've seen people, talking lately about how children can develop racist views and they sort of internalize societal racism by the time they're 3 or 4 years old. So sheltering our kids just it's not going to work.
Yeah, not good for anybody. Thank you. One more question for you. This has again been so wonderful. There's sort of a question about the right time for the debate, the right time for the question in a formal space or workspace. How do we navigate confronting issues with someone when it might create an opinion, when a joke, anything like that? Like knowing when it's going to be the most productive. Any advice for that?
Yeah, certainly. You'll need to use your own knowledge of your institution, your organization to find that moment. But I think also there probably won't be a right moment. Many people and many institutions aren't going to want to have these difficult conversations, and they're going to be uncomfortable and awkward no matter when you have them. So just, it's like jumping into a cold lake, just take the plunge and brace yourself. But you're creating the right time. You're creating the space.
Yeah, that's what you just said. You're creating the space. That's great. Jenna, we are so grateful in Ridgefield. You are so welcome to come visit anytime. It's
Thank you so
beautiful
much.
in the country. Thank you so much. I think you've given such concrete strategies and such concrete tools that people can take with them and rewatch this and learn. And I think this is just such a wonderful addition to what we can offer with Ridgefield Allies. So Jenna, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody. Be on the lookout for more live stream events coming at you very soon. Very grateful, Jenna. Thank you.